Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Bernard Fraga for a presentation, Latino Voting Power, Past, Present, and the 2024 Election. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to MACRI and everyone and all the work that you're doing. I'm a big fan, and this is a wonderful opportunity.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. Um, I wanted to share a little bit about Dr. Fraga's background, but before I do that, I just wanted to share that today is a special anniversary. Today is Dia de la Revolución, which commemorates the start of the Mexican Revolution on November 20th, 1910. This was an event that transformed not only Mexico, but also the United States, which received hundreds of thousands of refugees who then contributed to the growth of our nation. I'm sure many people who turn into MACRI events or MACRI programs have their own family stories about the Mexican Revolution. And I bring it up, and I think it's somewhat timely that we have Dr. Fraga with us tonight on Dia de la Revolución, because so many of those folks who fled Mexico and came to the US thought it'll just be a few years or maybe even a few months, we'll go back home. And the revolution lasted a decade. So by that time, a lot of people had set down roots in the United States, but also a lot of people really came to feel like they were part of and believed in that promise of democracy in the United States. And so they stayed. So I think it's just really an appropriate conversation tonight to be here with Dr. Fraga. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He's the inaugural Anne and Michael Hankin Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Faculty Coordinator of the Latino Studies Initiative at Emory University. His research examines racial and ethnic politics, voter turnout, and the influence of election laws on political behavior. He's the author of the award-winning 2018 book, The Turnout Gap: Race, Ethnicity, and Political Inequality in a Diversifying America. And findings from Dr. Fraga's work have been featured in various media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, CNN, and The Economist. He received his PhD and master's degree from Harvard University and his bachelor's from Stanford. Welcome again, Dr. Fraga.
Thank you so much for having me once again, and this is just a really, really special opportunity in many ways. As I was mentioning before, we got online. I'm a fourth generation Mexican American. My family crossed over slightly before the revolution in the early 1900s. And my grandfather was the first person in my family, extended family even, to be born in the US in 1911. And my dad, Luis Fraga, who's also a political scientist, was born and raised in Corpus Christi. I have a lot of family in Texas. And while I'm not a native Texan myself, Texas, and in particular South Texas, is where my family's 120-year American dream really started. So I'm really excited to be with you all and share some of my work on Latino voters. So I have some slides here. Let's see if we can get it to work. Looks like it's going okay. Let me just say real quick the kind of motivation for a lot of the work that I do. The United States has become dramatically more diverse since the 1960s, since the beginning of the African American Civil Rights Movement. I'm here in Atlanta at Emory University, the cradle of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And, at that time when we talked about race and ethnicity in the United States, it was really a black-white kind of a story. A lot of the landmark civil rights legislation, even the Voting Rights Act of 1965, later extended to Latinos and Asian Americans, was really designed and implemented for a society that was seen as kind of black-white. But in Texas in particular, other parts of the Southwest, we know it wasn't like that. Latinos were a large share of the population. But just want to indicate to you the dramatic change that we've seen when we talk about racial and ethnic minority groups in the US. While Latinos made up only 3.5% of the US population in 1960, now we're 18 to 20% of the population. And Asian Americans, while fast growing, are still more like 5 to 6%. So now when we talk about race, ethnicity, and politics in the US, Latinos have to be not just part of the story, but really central actors in the story in so many ways. So this motivates my work. And I say I talk about race and politics, that's what I study, but Latinos are central to that narrative, and I talk about that a lot in my work. I'm a political scientist, so I study voting. I study voting behavior in particular and who turns out to vote. This is the topic of my book, which I'll discuss in a minute. But, related to this story about race and ethnicity, when we discuss elections in the US, again, it's fallen on kind of white and black lines in many ways, right? Just looking over time, since the 1940s, we've seen tremendous growth in Black political participation in the US. Thanks to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, Black voter turnout grew tremendously in the 1950s and 1960s, getting close to white turnout. But still, over time, we've seen disparities. That is, gaps in voter turnout between white people and Black people in the US. This is a share of the eligible population. Black turnout in 2020, for example, lagged about 10 percentage points behind white turnout, again, among eligible adults, citizen adults, in that election. So we know that, race matters for who votes, and we know that whites have an advantage above and beyond their demographic size in the population. But when you add Latinos and Asian Americans into the mix, you see even larger disparities in voter turnout. Sometimes as big as 20 percentage point differences in presidential elections between the rate of turnout for, again, citizen adult Latinos versus the non-Hispanic white or the Anglo population. And while we've seen big gains in turnout for Asian Americans, especially in 2020, still disparities persist for that population too. But in 2020 and in 2024, based on preliminary data, as far as we can tell, Latinos had the lowest rate of voter turnout, again, among eligible, this is excluding non-citizens and young people, the lowest rate of voter turnout of any major racial and ethnic group in the country. So this really motivates a lot of my work, specifically on voter turnout. And I try and understand why we see these gaps in voter turnout, despite the removal of many of the formal barriers to participation. And this was a topic of my book. I look at white, Black, Latino, and Asian American voter turnout to try and understand why those differences persist. I look at historical records. I look at the stories and the narratives that people tell, but also do a kind of quantitative and statistical analysis of large-scale voter data from recent elections to say, where do we see pockets of higher turnout, lower turnout, and what can that tell us about what motivates people to vote in the first place? Now, I'm happy to talk more about my book in the Q&A, but in today's talk, I want to focus more on the patterns we've seen in the Latino vote and in Latino voter turnout, including in this most recent election. So I'm going to begin by outlining historical context that I think is very, very important for understanding the Latino vote. And then I'll talk about recent trends, the last 4 or 5 presidential election cycles. What have we seen in this so-called Latino vote? And then finally, I'll talk about, and this is what I think every political scientist has been working on furiously for the last 2 weeks, what happened in 2024? An election that everyone knew would be close, but where it looks like, at the very least, Donald Trump had a decisive victory in many states, including Texas and Georgia. Okay, so the first piece of context that I think many of the viewers probably already know, but I have to tell my students every time, is that Latinos, in particular Mexican Americans, are a long-standing citizen, that is voting eligible, at least in theory, population in the United States. So I showed you a chart before. I'm going to limit the number of charts a little bit, but just so you can get an idea of the numbers. At the beginning of the talk, we talked about the Mexican Revolution. As a result of the revolution, some before as well, but we saw a tremendous increase in the Mexican origin population in the US. Millions and millions of Mexican origin individuals, the vast majority of whom were born in the United States, today. But even going back to the 1920s and 1930s, the population of Mexican origin in the US has largely been one that is US born. That is, that has the potential, at least, where they're concentrated, to shape political outcomes and shape their political destiny. Mexican Americans have mattered, at least in theory, in terms of the electoral calculus in the United States for a very long time, for generations. Now, what has the response been historically? Well, this is a picture of the famous Texas Rangers in 1915 carrying out lynching of Mexican Americans. And we know that for much of our history, sadly, the Mexican American population in particular has been targeted for suppression of not just political activity, but basic social rights. We know that segregation, for example, is not just a story about African Americans in the Deep South, it's also about Mexican Americans in the Southwest, in particular, Arizona and Texas, in addition to other states. But we also know, while that's part of our history, at the same time that that was happening, there was resistance in San Antonio and other places, in Matanayuca, advocating for labor rights, not just for Latino men and Mexican American, later Chicano men, but also for Latinas, for the Mexican American women, who were often engaged in labor at a much higher rate than for Anglo or white women. We also know that as a result of World War II, we saw the entry into the workforce of hundreds of thousands of Mexican American women who were able to work in factories, replacing Latino men who were off fighting in World War II, who came back advocating for their rights as well. The American GI Forum. Again, things that we can talk about, a history that I know many of you are familiar with, but critical for understanding that our population is engaged politically and has been when given the opportunity or when taking the opportunity themselves. Now, when people talk about the Latino vote, and there's many good books about this, they often start with the Viva Kennedy campaigns and the importance of, again, not just Mexican Americans, but Mexican Americans in Texas in particular, for shaping the idea that Latinos could be an important part of the electorate and a constituency that was going to be largely Democratic. In addition to Puerto Ricans in New York, it was Mexican Americans in Texas and the Southwest, California as well, who were seen as shaping what it meant to be active politically and Latino in the US, a story that we still see today. And we know that for some Latinos, Mexican Americans, especially during the Chicano movement, there was a rejection of the kind of Democratic Party politics, the machine politics that we saw in South Texas. I don't want to deny that. The attempts to build a Chicano political party, a Raza Unida party, right, were an important step for our community too. So I'm giving you all of this context, which again, I know many of you are familiar with, to help understand the fact that a population with today the lowest rate of voter turnout, that does not mean a population that is politically apathetic, that is politically disinterested, that has not fought and won important victories for our community in the process. And also a community that understands politically that they need to see results in order to turn out to vote to support one or the other political party. What does the data show about the trends we've seen in the Latino vote in presidential elections? Now, we don't have great exit poll data. The exit poll data is not perfect, but going back to at least the 1980s, and likely before that as well, we talked about Viva Kennedy a little bit, 1960 election, the Latino population, again dominated by Mexican Americans, has favored Democrats in every presidential election by substantial, very wide margins since 1980, right? Has favored the Democratic Party. Same cannot be said for the Anglo population, which has favored Republicans in every presidential election since at least 1964. African Americans, too, have favored the Democratic Party. Asian Americans is a little bit more difficult to tell, but the point is that Latinos are a core part of the Democrats' political and electoral fortunes nationally as well, as they're a heavily Democratic-leaning group. Now, if you look at the chart, which I know is probably small for a lot of you, going from 1980 to 2016, you saw this increase that a lot of folks focus on in Republican voting, although not a majority, but around the 2004 election, where George W. Bush, right, former governor of Texas, was able to win a larger share of the Latino vote than we had seen in the past, maybe 40% of the Latino vote nationally, largely through the support he got in Texas and other southwestern states. Now, this narrative that the Latino vote could be won over by the right kind of Republican, by a Republican emphasizing family values, not denying the cultural heritage of Latinos necessarily, but understanding what Latinos value: religion, education, work, hard work, has been core to not just the public's understanding of what it would take, but also, I would say, academic understandings of the Latino vote and why we don't see Latinos shifting in the Republican direction. Enter the 2020 election, where it seemed like, and this is, I think, the major narrative, the potential for a shift in that pattern. What I'm speaking to here is the persistent narratives that we saw in the lead up, the summer especially, before the 2020 election, that something was happening with Latino voters where they were shifting towards not just the Republican Party, but to Donald Trump. Now, let me just outline for you why that was incredible and not believable, at least at the beginning, for political scientists, especially academics at universities across the country. The state of the literature circa 2020, before the November 2020 election, was that Latinos, as I showed you, were a generally Democratic-leaning population, both in vote choice, that is who they choose to vote for, but also in this longer-term party identification, a core concept in political science, this attachment to a political party that persists between elections. The idea is that Latinos, like African Americans, in between elections, if someone said, well, which party do you kind of think of yourself in terms of, which party do you feel closer to? They would say, well, the Democrats. The Democrats are the party that represents Latinos, not all Latinos, but at least most Latinos. So the idea is, they're attached to the party. And that there was the latent potential for Republican gains with Latinos again, if they just made the right kind of pitch. That is, if Republicans talked about, for example, abortion in the right way, it would appeal to Catholic Latinos, or the American dream in the right way. It would appeal to immigrant Latinos and their children, US born, who are much more likely to be eligible to vote and to turn out to vote, according to some studies. The idea is that there was always a recognized potential there, unlike with Black voters, where the idea was that was going to be a core Democratic constituency since the civil rights realignment in the 1960s. So a recognition that Latinos could swing, but that it hadn't happened yet. Right? This is, again, leading up to the 2020 election. But central to that was that Trump in particular, and his message, his anti-immigrant rhetoric and actions while in office, were the perfect way for Democrats to further entrench Latino identification and support for Democrats. That is, that take a Republican who says things about Latinos that are disparaging, that talks about immigrants in a negative way, that advocates policies that Democratic strategists, pollsters, and academics, frankly, said were anathema to Latinos. There's no chance of a gain there in the Latino vote by Republicans. In fact, it would make the Democrats' job even easier. That maybe they don't even need to do any mobilization because Trump himself would counter-mobilize. That is, would bring people back to the Democratic Party if they were kind of wavering. Just to refresh your memories about this, the very first speech Trump gave after descending his golden escalator, Trump Tower, in 2015, he said, when Mexico is sending its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Not just Democrats, but Republican elites, strategists said his campaign is over because he made this statement. They said there's no way he can win a Republican primary, much less a general election, because a candidate who makes statements like this is going to alienate Latino voters, but also Anglo voters who are going to say, this is too far, going too far. of course, we know what happened. 2016, Donald Trump is elected, Electoral College victory, right? One of the first things he does, executive orders related to immigration, related to banning entry of individuals from majority Muslim countries as well. But again, fulfilling promises that he made during the campaign in many ways that were, again, supposed to be anathema to Latinos. 2018, in advance of the midterm election, where Democrats did very well, evidence of use of tear gas launched at so-called migrant caravans just across the US-Mexico border, a crisis as described by Trump and Republicans, and images, children in cages, et cetera, that again, analysts said there's no way he's going to be able to win a substantial amount of Latinos because he's doing these actions, not just talking about them. Now, May 2019, in launching his re-election bid, what's his platform on immigration? Again, a set of items that were seen as impossible to win over Latino voters through. Merit-based immigration, a point system instead of family reunification. Patriotic assimilation, not addressing dreamers, who were seen as the population that was most clearly supported by the American people for some kind of amnesty and eventual citizenship, that is, individuals who are brought to the United States as minors, right, but are undocumented. And then, of course, expanding the border wall. Now, it's funny saying all this now because we know what the evidence says after the election, which I'll get to, I promise. But again, Republicans said there's no way he can win over Latino voters with this. This is a strategy to appeal to Anglos instead. But of course, the exit polls showed, which everyone thought were a lie at first, that he gained with Latino voters in 2020, even as he lost support among younger Americans, white women, and some other major groups. And he lost the election, remember, but did better among Latinos than he did in 2016. I remember when the election results were being announced in 2020, one of the first states to report was Florida. Down here, we saw these big red arrows in Miami and other places. And analysts all said, oh, it's the Cubans. It's just the Cubans shifting to Trump. Afraid about communism and other things. It worked. And then we saw the data from South Texas, right? The South Texas data where we saw big swings towards the Republicans. And honestly, at first, people said, there's no way that's true. It must be white voters in those places. Some of you may be laughing now because you get down to the valley, there's not a lot of Anglo voters there, right? It's all Latino, Mexican American. So these shifts were real. These gains were important and serious. Even as Trump lost nationally, he made big inroads with Latinos in Texas and Florida at least. And when all was said and done, we saw nationally big gains by Trump big gains by Latinos with Trump in 2020. In fact, an 8 percentage point shift away from the Democrats and towards Trump between 2016 and 2020, dropping from 71% support for Democrats to 63%, a larger shift than any other racial and ethnic group. Now, in a recent article, I address what caused this, what's happening here. We talk about how this is a real phenomenon, how this is something that might persist in the future. But we wrote this article and published it just recently before we had the 2024 election results. I want to highlight a few of the key findings, which I think help us to understand 2024 in context too. The first thing here, this is a graph showing by percent Latino in a neighborhood, how much support did we see for Trump in 2020 relative to 2016? And dots that are above the line here, this is like 60,000 neighborhoods in the US are places where Trump did better. Below is places where he did worse. What we see is that while he did worse, basically in places with very few Latinos, in places that were heavily Latino, Trump gained 5 to 20 percentage points in vote share relative to 2016. He did, in some places, 20 percentage points better in heavily Latino neighborhoods than he did in 2016. And not like a little gain. That's a really big jump. And if you look at Texas, which is the red line here, is the average you saw as we change the percent Latino in a neighborhood, that's where we're seeing places that get like a 30 percentage point gain in some Texas census tracts that are 85% plus Latino in the Valley, but also in places like Houston, heavily Latino areas there, Same thing we saw in some parts of San Antonio and in Dallas, other areas where we saw big gains by Donald Trump at the neighborhood level in Latino areas. This is real. This was a real shift. Now, again, when the results first came out, and many people still believe, they're like, oh, it's just the Cubans, right? It's just the Cubans. This chart here I like to show in class because I remind people that 60% of the Latino population in the United States is of Mexican origin. 60%. That's larger than any other group, larger than any other national origin group combined. Cubans are only 4% of the Latino population in the United States. Puerto Ricans are the second largest group at 9%. In terms of eligible voters, they're more like 15%, but Mexicans and Mexican Americans are still the largest potential voting bloc in the Latino electorate. That is, you cannot get the shifts of 8 points without it being, in part, a story about Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and individuals who are close to the immigrant experience themselves, at least in some ways. It's not just the Cubans. Now, when we look across different demographic categories, where did Trump make his gains? Basically, points and lines above are where Trump gained, below are where he lost. He won with exactly the kinds of Latinos that, if they were Anglo, shifted to Trump as well. That is, lower socioeconomic status Latinos, lower income, lower levels of education, disproportionately shifted to Trump. But also, Latinos who were second generation, that is, the US-born children of immigrants, here labeled first generation, as in the first generation born in the US. But the children of immigrants were the ones who shifted towards Trump in 2020 most, right? Relative to other generational groups. So it's not just that it's not a story about Cubans. It's not a story about third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation Latinos who maybe don't identify as Hispanic anymore. This is a story about people who recognize their Mexican or Mexican American or other national origin group heritage and voted for Trump in 2020. If we look at party and ideology, we also see a pattern that says these are Latinos who are aligned with the Republican Party already on core issues. People who already identified as Republicans shifted to Trump. People who are already identifying as conservative shifted to Trump. The ones who say they're liberal, especially very liberal, or are Democrats, they shifted to Biden. This is what we call polarization of the electorate. It's saying that Trump and Republicans were able to win Latinos who kind of should have been Latino or voting Republican anyway. And then if we look at issue positions, who are the Latinos that Trump did well with? The ones who favor restrictive immigration policy over here on the right part of the chart, and those who favor more conservative crime policy. That is, don't favor abolishing the police, but also say more funding for the police. They say that there should be a presumption of immunity for police actions, other kinds of things like increasing spending on prisons, other factors that indicate, again, alignment with not just the Republicans, but Donald Trump and his policy proposals in many ways. So, again, Latino voters shifting to the Republican camp to align with their pre-existing viewpoints. So, voting for Trump not despite his immigration stance or his stance on crime policy, but because of what he was saying. Now, when we had this finding in the paper, what we said was, this is a sign of a durable shift in Latino attitudes, at least among those who are already conservative. Because what it says is those individuals are not going to go back to the Democratic Party. And also, there's not really a way for the Democrats to win them over. What are they going to say? They favor like more spending on border wall construction or limiting asylum? That's probably not realistic, right? Well, looking at the trends in 2022, we saw a continuation of Latinos who supported Trump in 2020 also supporting Republicans down ballot. Again, a majority of Latinos still voting Democratic, that's what the numbers show here, but 62%, same number, supporting Republicans for Congress in 2022 as well. So again, shift is still there. Equis Research, a firm out of New York and Florida that does fantastic work on Latinos in examining the 2022 results, has some other interesting tidbits in the survey data of what happened with Latino voters. What they found was that even among Latinos who believe that Democrats are the better party for the Hispanic or Latino population, they said they don't trust the Democrats to keep their promises on immigration, and that they take Latinos and Hispanics for granted. Not quite a majority, but when you're talking about 40 to 50% of Latinos who say they like the Democrats, or at least think the Democrats are good for Latinos, but that Democrats don't keep their promises, that's not a good recipe for success for Democrats. Especially when you add in the fact that immigration really declined, according to ECIS, as a major factor in vote choice for Latino voters in 2020 and 2022. While there were still some signs on immigration that in a few swing states, Latinos thought Democrats would be better, Florida, Texas, and Georgia, you had now Latinos saying actually the Republicans would be better on immigration, in part because they felt the Democrats had broken too many promises over too many years related to immigration reform. Add to that Republicans making inroads with Latinos, opening up here just in the county next to where I live in Atlanta, Hispanic outreach centers. They called them Hispanic community centers. Saw some of this in Texas as well. The idea that Republicans are trying to appeal to a population that the Democrats talked about but weren't really serving quite as much. And then, of course, we saw a big expansion of Republicans fielding candidates, especially Latinas in South Texas, right? Obviously, but other parts of the country too, running Latinas in many places for Congress in an attempt to win over Latino voters, but also in a way to show that they can build a multiracial coalition too. Now, again, like in 2020, despite Republicans at least attempting to make inroads with Latinos, Joe Biden, Democratic Party, did surprisingly well in the 2022 midterm election. Many pundits said the reason why is things like Joe Biden taking a much harder stance on immigration. Remember I said, no one thought that after Trump's success in 2020 and winning over these conservative Latinos, the idea would be, oh, the Democrats should adopt conservative immigration policy that would alienate the remaining Latinos in the Democratic coalition. Well, Biden, to a large degree, shifted more to the center, I'll put it that way, on issues of immigration, particularly border security, won the election. So the narrative, again, was maybe the Latino electorate, if shifting towards Trump, is not really the group that Democrats should be focusing on, at least in the way that they were before, with appeals related to immigration and the threat that Trump posed. Now we're getting into 2024, right? So this election cycle, a big question was, would we see a continuation of the trend with Latino voters that we saw in 2020 and 2022? Or was that kind of like the ceiling for Republicans or the floor for Democrats? That is, had the Republicans won all the Latinos they could, and now there was no chance for future gains. Now, Trump shifted strategies in some ways. He talked about immigration and brought it up as a major issue. There was polling that indicated the American public in particular, including Latinos, were more concerned about border security than they were before, and were especially upset at Biden and, by extension, Harris, related to the border and immigration. But me included, you can pull up CNN. I'm on there saying, I think Republicans reached a ceiling and they won't do better with Latinos in 24 than they did in 2020. So what happened? Well, they did even better. According to the data that we have so far, and again, happy to talk about more of this in the Q&A, what we know, what we don't, just based on county election totals, we saw a continuing shift, not just maintenance of the same support Republicans had before, but even more support for Republicans in Texas in particular, but in particular, heavily Latino areas of South Texas, where you saw counties that had not voted for a Republican in decades, and probably had never voted Republican with a majority of Latinos voting Republican, voting for the Republican Party, including in the Valley and in other parts of South Texas. Here's another map just showing that same pattern, where in 2016, South Texas for Hillary Clinton was a bastion of Democratic support. And many people thought It was about the continuation of this blue part of South Texas in particular, in addition to urban areas, Dallas, Austin, Bexar County, San Antonio, right? Houston, that those places were key to the Democrats maybe winning and turning Texas blue. 2020, we saw a shift, but those areas are still somewhat blue for the most part. 2024, it's gone. Wipeout. Just zooming in here to emphasize the point. You saw counties in the valley voting Republican for the first time in decades. Again, with majority, like vast majority, Latino electorates. Heading into 2020, another question was whether this was about the Republican Party turning out new voters or taking Democrats and turning them into Republicans. The evidence that I had seen was that this was mostly a story about a lot of Latino Republicans, again, who were already aligned with the party, Republican Party, turning out for the first time to vote, particularly in the Valley and other areas where the gains were most prominent. But in 2024, the evidence so far indicates that there really was a swing, that Republicans didn't just pick up new Latino voters, they actually were able to eat into the total number of votes that Democrats got, either by Democrats staying home this time or by some of them swinging to the Republican Party. So Republicans, I think, in South Texas in particular, have not hit a ceiling yet. They could do even better and flip some of those congressional and state legislative seats. Now, what happened with Latino voters? What were the issues that they said were important? Pre-election polling indicated, as many of you would agree, the economy was really, really critical. 51%, this is just looking at Latino men in battleground states, in a pre-election poll by Democratic-aligned pollsters, indicated that the most important issue for Latino men in battlegrounds was the cost of living or inflation. Second most important, jobs and the economy. Broadly speaking, those are both the economy. That's like 90%, saying that those are most important. There's some overlap there because people can say more than one is important. Housing costs and affordability, healthcare costs, only 16% abortion and reproductive rights. 56% of Latino men, according to this poll, voted for Harris, 43% Trump. That is, again, historic high numbers for Latino men in support for Republicans. For Latinas, similar story. Abortion a little bit higher on the chart there, but cost of living, jobs in the economy, most important. And while Harris did better among Latinas than Latino men, still 32% of Latinos voting for Trump, again, gains over the success that he had with Latinos in 2020. So not just a story about Latino men, also Latinas voting Republican in greater numbers. So a continuation of the trend we saw in 2020 under a somewhat different set of circumstances. Now, Trump not being the incumbent, rhetoric in some ways that is more severe, related to immigration in particular, but a lot of other kinds of policies, even greater support among Latinos for the GOP that doesn't show signs, based on this data at least, of really halting anytime soon. Now, and this is maybe something to talk about in the Q&A, when we look at the polling data and think about the path forward for Democrats, I was looking at some of the Obama year discussion, like 2012, Julian Castro, San Antonio native, right, gave the keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention that year. I was looking at what he was talking about at that convention. And he was talking about hard work. He was talking about the American dream, talking about things in a way, honestly, that with the exception of some particulars on immigration policy and rhetoric regarding the border, sounded a lot like the Republican appeals that are made in these heavily Latino areas and made by Republican candidates. This is a poll done in 2022 before the midterm. And the question was, what are the best ways to honor the legacy of your parents, grandparents, and ancestors? Among Latinos, men and women, so Latinos and Latinas, and a majority said the best way to honor kind of our ancestors is to work hard to support the family. And while Latinas said, well, culture, music, food, clothing, also important, we still see that hard work, education, learning history, so pride and culture, but really kind of things that are fueled by the state of the economy are really critical components as well. Voting in elections is lower on the list. Fighting injustice is lower on the list too. Not saying they're not important, but we're really talking here about the potential for a set of appeals that have to be broader, right, than just the cultural or immigration policy related appeals, social justice related appeals, which again are very important, that we've seen, the Democrats really try and counter the Trump messaging with. And again, a set of appeals that is, I would say, distinct from what political scientists thought Republicans needed to do. Not about religion or abortion necessarily, but about the kind of America and American value kind of narratives that fit our Republican Party platform, but are not Latino specific necessarily. And again, this is something that I think we saw across all groups. So if there's one kind of takeaway here for what happened with Latinos in 2024, it's that the shift we saw with Latinos is a shift we saw with Americans across racial and ethnic groups, including with African Americans. That is, swing voters in particular said the economy was very, very bad, was so negative. Here looking at swing voters, negative 53 Democrats on the economy saying the state of the economy is negative instead of positive. And Harris voters were 50-50 on whether the economy was good or bad. Personal financial situation also in the red, indicating that voters were hungry for a change, even if that change was a return to Trump. And then the last thing I'll say about this, and then I want to open it up for questions, is really the potential that still exists for a more engaged or participatory, in terms of voting, Latino electorate to shape outcomes going forward. This year, we saw a rate of voter turnout that was a little bit lower, but substantially similar nationally to what we saw in 2020, which was the highest turnout election we'd seen in 100 years. However, in heavily Black and especially heavily Latino counties in the US, Kamala Harris got 18 percentage points less vote overall in those heavily Latino counties than Joe Biden did in 2020. And while Trump, again, did better, 7% better than he did in those heavily Latino areas than he did in 2020, we're still talking about a missing about 11% of Latino voters who just stayed home, which would exceed the gains that Trump made. It would have made it an even, basically, race, 2020 to 2024. So there's a lot of questions here about what's going to happen in the future. But to me, as someone who studies voter turnout, it says there's still the potential of the Latino vote to shape Democratic and maybe increasingly Republican Party fortunes going forward. So we'll see what happens in the future. We'll see what the Trump administration brings in terms of the Latino population and what happens in the midterm in 2026 and 2028. But with that, I'll open it up to the questions you all have if we still have time, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Wow, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have some questions, and also I just want to acknowledge that I think that so some people were saying where they were joining in from, and we've got Houston and we've got Corpus Christi, places that
Yeah.
we're fortunate to often get folks from, but we have somebody with us today from Springfield, Massachusetts. So I just wanted to say hello out there in Springfield. Here's a comment, which I think probably a lot of people can resonate with. It says, thank you for your talk. Just a comment. I'm from the Rio Grande Valley and have some friends who support Trump. And the two things they keep saying are he helps small businesses and he's pro-life. Some family in Houston claim they support him because of apparent pro-business stance. When I bring up immigration, these supporters say that that was not a factor for them, and they dismiss the convictions and the impeachments. They dismiss the rhetoric, and they argue that that's just all talk. Have you been hearing that a lot?
Yeah, I have. As someone who studies elections and voting, and very much believes in democracy, rule of law, you know, as many other political scientists do. When the Democrats talked about this election in 2020 and 2016 too, as the future of democracy is in the hands of the voters, right? That this is about a struggle for what kind of democracy we want. That resonates, right, with me. It doesn't resonate with the electorate. All of the evidence that we have from polling and other data is that voters were very much not convinced. Maybe it's because it's like the third time Democrats have said it, but that democracy is on the line. At least the ones who were considering or making a choice between voting for Trump or voting for Harris. They did not think that democracy was on the line in the same way. What they thought was on the line was the economy, and they really felt that Donald Trump had a better plan, or at least a plan, or at least how did he put it? Concepts of a plan to improve economic fortunes, or could do it better than the Democrats could in the 4 years that they were in office. Again, a big mistake that I made, and I think a lot of us make this mistake, is we looked at this election and said, oh, do people want to keep Joe Biden and Harris, his vice president, a manifestation of the Biden White House, or do they want to return to Trump? But for many voters, it was simply, do we like the way things have gone the last 4 years? And if they said no, they want to change. And the change happens to be someone who was formerly the president, who had these convictions, and I don't have to go into all the legal issues there, et cetera, et cetera. They just wanted to change. And they said, we're going to trust a person that is different. His rhetoric, I think, reinforced that message. And I think it makes sense. The abortion factor, the pro-life factor, is, I think, a kind of interesting undercurrent, given that Trump was kind of wavering on national abortion ban. But I think people who were pro-life understood that he would be far, far better on the abortion issue, in their opinion, than any Democrat.
Well, that actually is points directly to another question that we received. Based on your research, do you think this red shift in deep South Texas was more of an issues shift as opposed to more of a shift towards the Republican Party? It sounds like you were saying it could be an issues thing rather than I deeply feel connected to the party.
Well, I think, this is a really, important and interesting question that obviously Democrats and Republicans are asking right now. How durable, how long lasting is this shift? Will it extend beyond Trump? My first inclination when starting work in really the summer of 2020, when we started seeing signs that maybe Trump is set to make some gains with Latino voters based on polling data, was, this is like a Trump, machismo kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. We've heard this narrative. The idea is he's been convicted, of crimes, we know the story. The idea that it's something about an inherent kind of favoring among Latino men, like a machista kind of attitude that exists in our population. Now, I thought, maybe that would be revealed in the polling. I thought that something about Trump and his swagger or whatever was part of the story. We didn't find any evidence of that. We really didn't. And it's hard because when I talk to journalists, less now, but especially between 2020 and 2024, that's the first thing. Non-Latino journalists, non-Latinas, right? Anglo journalists, they're like, oh, it's because Trump is manly. And then they're like, oh, it's because, those Latinos really like kind of manly figures because they're all kind of, they don't say it, but machista. And I'm like, I question that. I don't think it's just a vibes kind of thing. And I don't think it's sexism purely. We saw a shift among Latinas as well. I think it's a story about two factors. One is a pre-existing Republican-leaning Latino population in the Valley and other places that now say, finally, I have something to vote for, a party and a candidate that's speaking to me about the issues that I care about in the way that I care about them in the Republican Party. And now in 2024, the potential for people saying, wow, things are just so bad economically, they're willing to support this Trump guy that now their neighbor has come out as a Trump supporter, or they've opened up a community center, or the Republican Party has started fielding candidates in places where they weren't competitive before. They're saying, this looks like something I'm willing to try. The question is whether they would still vote Republican if, after 4 years of a Trump administration, again, they didn't see gains. That's the deeper question. Can Trump perform in a way that those voters want him to?
Similar to the machista theory, there were a number of comments about racism in the Latino community. Do you feel that racism in the Latino community may have led to some Latino voters skipping this election?
Yeah, that's a good question. Another thing that we explored a lot and talk a lot about. So the simple, short answer is no. And that short part of the answer is really when thinking about anti-Black racism. So as we all have seen, perhaps in our families, our communities, yes, there is a substantial amount of prejudice, even racism, anti-Blackness that exists among Latinos and other racial and ethnic groups too, right? Academics, researchers, studied this, identified it, can talk a lot about anti-Blackness existing in Latin America. As I've talked about many times here, most Latinos, especially most Latino eligible voters, are born in the US, are socialized here. We're socialized into a country that in many ways has a far way to go in terms of addressing anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, and the persistence of that historically. But I don't think that's something unique to Latinos. And the evidence that I've seen on this is that, if anything, it is less of a factor in Latino vote choice than it is for whites. The best evidence for this is Obama. The Latino electorate has changed a lot since 2008 and 2012, but polling data showing that Latinos who demonstrate and say they're prejudiced against Black people turned out and voted for Obama. For whites, it was like a direct relationship. It's like anti-Black whites, racist whites voted Republican, voted against Obama. For Latinos, it's like a flat line. Latinos were prejudiced but willing to vote for a Black candidate for president. So that's a simple thing. The deeper part to me is the possibility of this, in some ways, the crisis at the border and what we're seeing being some kind of manifestation of prejudice against recent immigrants and immigrants who are not of Mexican origin, in particular, Central and South American migrants, right? A different population of migrants than what we've seen historically. I think that's something that's deeper that we need to think about, but again, is shared by certainly Anglos, African Americans as well, other groups, this prejudice against more recent immigrants from Central and South America, the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. We will have a number of good questions here, so we'll try to get to all of them. One of our viewers says, I live in Dallas County, where we were down 100,000 voters this year. I find that the Democrats focus on the swing states and abandon voters in Texas. So do you think that following this election, there are reasons why people focus on the swing states when they have limited resources and can only be in one place at one time. But do you think that this is going to bring any future attention to the non-swing states?
Well, I think, two parts of the story here. First of all, Texas is a lot more of a swing state than a lot of other states. So I think the magnitude of polarization in many states, including like Florida now, which in 2000 was obviously the quintessential swing state, it's like, I think 15 to 20 points in the Republican direction now. Texas, I don't think the margin is that large. So we're talking about, a very small number of swing states where the Democrats now in 2 out of 3 elections, that is Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, lost, right? They're looking for new places. They're looking for new places to make gains. Now, the shift among Latinos makes Texas a very, very difficult place, but Arizona, swing state now. Democrats lost it, but they didn't lose the Senate election there. Gallego won, Latino, right? Latino in the Senate. Nevada, another swing state. Georgia, obviously a swing state. I think that Democrats still will look to Texas as a place where there are opportunities, certainly more than many, many other states that are just seen as so deep red there's no chance. Like Ohio is completely off the map now. Florida is off the map. Texas is much more on the map than Ohio and Florida, which again, 20 years ago were swing. So don't lose hope. But I do think it is a tough road forward for the Texas Democratic Party. They still have to win, though. It's not like they can go to another swing state. They still have to focus on winning here.
All right. Now, somebody here's got kind of a deep cut of a question, and I have to wonder, have you been watching MACRI talks? This question is, do you think the Plyler v. Doe case, which was pioneered by Mexican immigrants, will get overturned by the current Supreme Court? So that's a case that we've talked about here in this space before.
Yeah. These are the kinds of things that I think, obviously I worry about. Just personally, foundational in so many ways to our understandings of like what it means to be not just an American, but what America is about, right? Educating children regardless of like their parent status. But then I see things like, oh, well, Trump is, proposing getting rid of birthright citizenship, which is in the 14th Amendment, and is so entrenched in what it means to be American and a nation of immigrants. My fear is not so much that the Supreme Court will overturn that decision, but that decision will effectively be overturned without the court even needing to rule on it. I think that's what's really going on, is the idea of, Trump saying, the court made that decision, let them enforce it, right? I'm not going to do it. And some of the things we've seen reported in the news are things like, instead of ending birthright citizenship through like a constitutional amendment, which wouldn't work because you wouldn't get the states to support it or Congress, not issuing Social Security cards or birth certificates to the children of undocumented immigrants who are born in U.S. hospitals. That would not end birthright citizenship, but just make it extremely difficult for them to assert citizenship and, for example, get a passport. And effectively would make undocumented immigrants, the children, stateless and really in this like weird limbo that is, again, totally contrary to our notions of America. So that's my bigger fear.
And a question about the impact of the growing evangelical movement in Latino communities. Did you see any impact of evangelical voters here?
So, two things. One is, it's too early to tell with the 2024 election. We saw continued gains by Trump among Latinos. Maybe that was disproportionately evangelical, but evangelical Latinos have been a much more Republican voting group than Catholic Latinos, or certainly Latinos who don't identify with a religious kind of affiliation denomination, not Christian or otherwise. So I don't know how much room there is for Republicans to make more gains among evangelical Latinos, right? Similar to the most ardently pro-life Latinos who were already Republican. Even in those years where Democrats were doing well, Republicans were still getting 25% of the Latino vote. That was, again, Latinos who are very, very ardently anti-abortion, often evangelical, et cetera. So it's really a question of, were they able to pick up more people rather than did they maintain their support?
We had a comment or a question about the charts and the graphs that you were using.
Yeah.
And I just want to say this is going to stay on our YouTube page, so you can go back and look at these charts later on. And it looked to me like you had citations on them too. So
Yeah,
I
a few
think
of them,
you
yeah.
could probably look those up if you really want to learn more about them.
Yes.
I guess just one sort of concluding question. Thanksgiving is next week. Any advice for folks heading to politically split family gatherings?
Just listen. I would say it's, as hard as it might be, I think it's really interesting to listen to what people's perspectives are. And oftentimes what we found and what we find is people have the same concerns. They just have very different ideas about how to fix them. And we just got to hear, at very least to know what's coming down the line.
I suspect we're going to be having these conversations for a long time. And that folks like you, political scientists, will be unpacking this election for years to come. I know that we could talk about this all night, and there will be more opportunities. So I don't want to take up more time than you committed, but I do thank you for joining us and for sharing your
Thank
wonderful
you all.
research with us. I do think it helped us understand a bit more, because I think in the last few weeks, so many of us have been asking, what exactly happened?
Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the folks who are watching live tonight. And thank you for spending time with us in your evening. I also want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, the Spurs Give, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Foundation, and individual donors like you. If you like tonight's presentation, we have more presentations coming up, always more things for you. We have coming up December 10th, we have a special MACRI Talk Libros y Amigos, the story of America from the Mexican-American perspective. This is a book for middle readers that just came out by Dr. David Romo. He's been a MACRI Talk speaker before. He's back with a new book. And again, this is a book for middle schoolers. So anybody can read it, of course, but a great holiday gift if you've got young people in your life. And then we also have an in-person event coming up on December 14th. We're doing a pop-up at the Holidays on Houston Street, Saturday, December 14th from 2 to 9. We will have our Alonso Perales exhibit up in the street. Alonso Perales officed on Houston Street when he was alive. So we're just going to be down the street from where he officed, and you can tour the exhibit. We also will have some make and take holiday ornaments, so you can make a holiday ornament featuring a Mexican-American civil rights trailblazer. And then, of course, I also want to remind you that Giving Tuesday is coming up. Giving Tuesday this year is December 2nd. That's an annual day of giving, and we need support from people like you to keep MACRI going. Did you know we're building the nation's first museum dedicated to Mexican-American civil rights history? We are. We need your support. So please turn out for our future programs, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and if you can make a donation, we would love that. I want to just say thank you again, Dr. Fraga.
Thank you. This was wonderful. And thank you for the great questions, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone who turned out tonight. Gracias and good night.